Smoke still hung in the doorway when Bumpy Johnson stepped inside, an insult loud enough to be a threat, yet the room waited, because something far bigger than fire was about to answer. The smell reached him before the sight did. Not smoking anymore was what came after. Burnt wood, wet ash, something personal taken and left exposed. Bumpy Johnson stepped inside without hesitation. The doorway groaned under his weight, charred but standing. Walls blackened. Shelves collapsed into themselves like tired men who had tried to hold the line too long. What had been ordered was now disorder, but not chaos. Chaos makes noise. This place was quiet, too quiet. Men stood back along the edges of the room. No one spoke. No one moved. Every eye followed Bumpy, not his feet, his face. They were waiting for anger, waiting for heat. They didn't get it. Bumpy walked slowly, not inspecting, remembering. This wasn't just a business. It was proof. Proof that things could be built clean in a dirty city. Proof that Harlem didn't belong to whoever shouted loudest or burned fastest. He stopped where the counter used to be, bent slightly, picked up a piece of scorched wood, turned it once in his hand, let the ash fall. An insult, yes, but also a message. Someone thought fire could move him. Bumpy straightened. I looked around the room. He didn't ask questions, didn't curse, didn't promise anything. That was worse. Promises warn people. Silence makes them imagine. One man shifted his weight. Another swallowed hard. They knew the rules. Violence was always an option in this city, but never the first move. Not for Bumpy. He believed in order, in sequence, in letting men reveal themselves fully before deciding what they deserved. He set the wood back down. This wasn't random, he said calmly. Not loud, not sharp. Just true. No one argued, because everyone already knew who had sent the message. An enforcer trying to make a name. Fire as punctuation. A belief that destruction earned respect. Bumpy breathed in once more. Let the smell settle in his chest. He wanted to remember it not for revenge, but for record. Every lesson needed a marker. He turned toward the door. Outside, Harlem waited, not anxiously, expectantly. People would ask what he planned to do. They always did. He wouldn't answer them. Plans spoken aloud lose their edge. What mattered was not what Bumpy would do, but how long it would take for the truth to reach the right ears. The fire was loud, but consequences traveled, and somewhere uptown, a man who thought he'd made a strong move was about to learn the difference between noise and power. Bumpy stepped back into the street. The ashes stayed behind. The weight moved with him. By morning, the fire had already stopped burning. By noon, everyone knew why it mattered. Harlem didn't need announcements. It ran on recognition, small looks, quiet confirmations, doors opening that I wasn't used to. Men at corners stopped talking when Bumpy passed, not out of fear, but alignment. Women behind counters nodded once. Old men on stoops watched longer than usual. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. The business that burned wasn't just Bumpy's. It was a signal of order, a place where debts were settled without blood, where respect traveled both directions. Burning it was like tearing down a church and calling it progress. Harlem felt the insult personally. Bumpy walked the neighborhood like he always did, unhurried, hands loose at his sides. He didn't carry rage with him. Rage attracts attention. He carried certainty. That kind of weight settles rooms without effort. Runners found him without being called. Shop owners spoke carefully, choosing words like they were placing glass. Even men who had nothing to gain made sure. He saw them standing nearby. This was the community layer, not loyalty bought with threats, but with consistency. Bumpy listened more than he spoke. Names floated up without him asking. The enforcer's reputation, the boss behind him, the mistake between the two. Information moves toward Bumpy the way heat moves toward cold. Naturally, someone offered to retaliate, quietly, efficiently. A knife in an alley, a car that wouldn't start again. Harlem had options. Bumpy declined with a glance. Not yet, he said. 2 words, enough to stop everything, because the people around him understood the rhythm. Violence wasn't strength. It was admission. Admission that you couldn't control the next hour, let alone the next year. Bumpy was thinking longer. He paused outside a bar, that had outlasted 3 owners and 2 wars. The man inside had seen Harlem change colors more times than the streetlights. Their eyes met through the glass. No words, just understanding. The city was watching how this would be handled. If Bumpy answered fire with fire, it would tell the wrong story. It would say anyone could drag him into noise. But if he stayed calm, if he forced the pressure upward, then everyone would learn something permanent. The enforcer thought Harlem was isolated, thought power lived downtown, thought flames erased boundaries. He was wrong. Pressure doesn't explode outward, it climbs, and by the time it reaches the top, there's nowhere left to hide. Bumpy kept walking. Harlem walked with him. Even when he was alone, the man who ordered the fire slept well that night. That told Bumpy everything he needed to know. An enforcer who sleeps after lighting a match believes the story is finished. He believes fear travels faster than consequence. He believes his name is now heavier than the one he challenged. Men like that always move too soon. The enforcer started letting it be known, nothing direct, nothing traceable. Just smiles held a second too long. Drinks sent to the wrong tables. A quiet pride in his posture. He wanted Harlem to feel smaller when he walked through it. But Harlem didn't shift. Doors still opened for Bumpy. Conversation still paused when his name entered a room. The enforcer noticed. That's when confidence began to itch. He sent a second message. Not fire this time. Words. The kind meant to travel crooked. Bumpy was finished. The neighborhood was changing. New rules. New protection. Protection always costs more than respect. Bumpy heard it all without comment. He didn't correct the lie. Lies collapse faster when they're allowed to stretch. He was interested in what the enforcer would do next when noise failed. The man had muscle, not memory. He thought intimidation worked in straight lines. Didn't understand that Harlem was layered, built on favors, funerals, quiet meals paid for without asking. The enforcer had burned a business. Bumpy had built a city. They crossed paths once, briefly, on a street where no one rushed. The enforcer nodded, just enough to suggest equality, just enough to insult without witnesses. Bumpy returned the look, calm, flat, almost bored. No threat, no warning. That was the moment the enforcer felt it, the imbalance, the sense that the room wasn't his, even when Bumpy said nothing. Dominance through restraint, control through absence of effort. He compensated the only way he knew how. He went louder. That was the mistake, because loud men attract attention, and attention doesn't stop at street level. It travels upward, following money, complaints, and discomfort. Eventually, it reaches men who prefer things quiet, men who dislike surprises, men who recognize Bumpy Johnson's name as a stabilizing force, not a rival. By the time the enforcer realized his fire hadn't ended the conversation, it was already being discussed somewhere he couldn't enter. And Bumpy? He waited, not patiently, precisely. The first call wasn't angry. I was cautious. A man downtown asked another man what had happened in Harlem. The answer came measured, careful, no opinions, just facts. A business burned, no retaliation, no noise, just Bumpy Johnson still walking free. Silence unsettles powerful people more than violence ever does. Another call followed, then another. Meetings that were meant to be about numbers drifted into something else. Questions formed without being asked directly. Why hadn't Bumpy responded? Why was the neighborhood steady? Why were complaints starting to surface from people who didn't usually complain? Because stability had been disturbed, and stability was profitable. The enforcer's boss started hearing his name paired with words he didn't like. Unnecessary, messy, attention. Men at his level hated those words. They suggested loss of control. He summoned the enforcer, not to punish him, not yet, to understand him. The enforcer explained the fire like it was a strategy, like it proved strength. He spoke fast, confident, trying to sell finality. But confidence sounds different to men who've survived longer than you. His boss listened, let him finish, then asked a question that landed heavier than any accusation. Is Bumpy Johnson still standing? The enforcer hesitated, just long enough. That pause did the damage, because everyone in that room knew the rule. If Bumpy Johnson was still standing, The situation wasn't resolved. It was suspended, waiting. And suspended problems always fall downward eventually. Pressure increased quietly. Routes delayed. Deals slowed. Protection requests reconsidered. No explanations given. Just friction. Enough to be noticed. Not enough to be traced. The enforcer felt it first. His confidence thinned. He stopped smiling in public. Started looking over his shoulder, not for Bumpy, but for absence, for support that didn't arrive. Meanwhile, Bumpy said nothing. That was the brilliance of it. He forced the conflict to rise above him, made it too big to stay personal, too inconvenient to ignore. The fire that was meant to isolate him had instead exposed the enforcer as a liability, a man who couldn't read the room, a man who confused fear with authority. The boss made his decision alone, not out of kindness, out of necessity, because Harlem didn't need to be conquered. It needed to remain calm, and the only man who guaranteed that calm was the one who hadn't raised his voice once. See, the rebuilding started before any apology was spoken. That detail mattered. Trucks arrived early. Lumber, glass, men who worked without asking questions. No banners, no announcements, just quiet labor where ash had been. Harlem noticed. Harlem always noticed. Bumpy watched from across the street, not supervising, not interfering, letting the message form on its own. Restoration speaks louder than regret when it's done correctly. Then came the meeting, not private. That was the point. The boss arrived without an entourage, no show of force, just presence. He stood where people could see him, because this wasn't about saving face, it was about correcting it. Bumpy stepped forward, calm as ever. No smile, no tension. Two men standing at different ends of the same truth. The boss spoke first. Not long, not rehearsed. He acknowledged the damage, took responsibility for the fire as if it had been his own hand. Words chosen carefully, not to excuse but to close. Then he did the thing no one expected. He lowered himself, knees on pavement, in public. In Harlem, the street went still, not because of submission, but recognition. Recognition of whose rules applied here, of who held the balance, of how power sometimes survives by bowing, not striking. Bumpy said nothing. He didn't need to accept the apology out loud. The rebuilding team already said yes. The kneeling said more. And the silence afterward sealed it. The enforcer was never mentioned. He didn't need to be. Men like him fade when their usefulness expires. History remembers outcomes, not sparks. The boss rose, dusted his knees, met Bumpy's eyes once more. It was over. No handshake, no forgiveness offered, just resolution, clean, final. By the end of the week, the business stood again, stronger, brighter, a reminder set in brick and glass that destruction was temporary, but authority endured. Harlem returned to its rhythm, and everyone understood the lesson. Fire can demand attention, but restraint commands respect. The street settled back into itself. That was the real victory. No celebrations, no victory laps, just Harlem breathing normally again. Businesses opening on time, music leaking from windows, children running past corners that hadn't changed hands, order restored without spectacle. The rebuilt place didn't stand taller than before. It didn't need to. Its strength was in what it represented now. Proof that damage could be reversed when power was exercised correctly. Proof that dignity, once defended, didn't have to shout again. Bumpy Johnson walked past it like any other building. That told people more than any speech could. Men who'd been watching from a distance recalculated. Younger ones learned without being taught. Older ones nodded, recognizing a familiar truth. Violence ends stories early. Restraint lets them last. The boss kept his word. Harlem stayed quiet. Routes smoothed out. Respect flowed back into places it had briefly been interrupted. No one tested the line again, because lines drawn without blood tend to hold longer. Bumpy never spoke publicly about the fire. He didn't turn it into legend. Legends attract challengers. He let the story live where it belonged, in memory, in caution, in the way decisions were made afterward. That was the legacy layer. Years from now, people would forget the enforcer's name. They'd forget the smell of smoke. They might even forget the exact words that were spoken that day, but they would remember this: When Bumpy Johnson was insulted, the city didn't burn. It corrected itself. That power, when exercised with restraint, reshapes the future quietly. And that some men don't need to strike back to be understood. They just have to stand still long enough for the world to move around them.